Well, welcome to week 3 of History 109, World History since 1500. Today we're going to look at the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries and all that entailed. But before we discuss how the world changed, we want to talk a little bit about how people viewed, at least in Western civilization, science and the world in general before the scientific revolution. Well, before the scientific revolution, from the time of the Greeks and Romans on, the world was seen as kind of a deductive world. That is, the world is a subtraction of its parts. In philosophy, or in generally in thinking, when you start with deduction, that means you have this general overarching principle or statement that you make, and then everything else is contingent upon it. How does that work? Well, as early as 430 BC, Empedocles, a Greek, stated that the world was composed of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Seems simple enough. He just looked around him and said, there seems to be 4 elements. You know, when the Chinese looked at the world, they saw 5 different elements. So, it varied from place to place, but we'll just use, for instance, the Greek example here since it had the most effect on Western civilization. Now, if you take that idea of 4 elements, and then you say, well, why does smoke rise heavenward? Why does it rise up to the sky? Well, Aristotle would explain that is, well, it rises to the sky because smoke is air, and air belongs with air, and air is up in the sky. And similarly, why, if you throw an object up, would Aristotle say that it falls to the earth? It's because earth, an object, belongs to earth. They need to be together. Obviously, we can see the problem here. If you have and hold this kind of theory, it really prevents you from moving on to other theories like finding out what gravity is. Well, the Greeks then deduced. Okay, so the next step is to take this idea that the earth is composed of 4 elements and say that human beings are also composed of 4 elements. They called them the 4 humors. And each of those 4 humors corresponded to one of the 4 elements. For instance, black bile in human beings, I don't think I have to explain that one to you, corresponded to earth. Yellow bile, don't think that needs explanation either, corresponded to water. Phlegm was air. Fire was like blood. After all, both of them were red, right? Then they said, well, if the earth is composed of 4 elements, and they deduced that human beings are hence composed of 4 elements or 4 humors, then the personalities of human beings could be described through the 4 humors, and that every human being had a different balance of humors, and some were more controlled by one humor than another humor. So a person who was controlled by, say, black bile might be the kind of person that always goes around with a cloud above them. We might say in our own society, in our own language, that person is always feeling kind of crappy, literally controlled by black bile. Yellow bile, that person would be kind of choleric, right? Always a little bit angry. In our own language, always a little bit pissed off at the world. A person controlled by phlegm. You've all had colds and sinus infections and flus, and if you have a lot of phlegm, you don't really have a lot of energy to do anything. You're feeling rather phlegmatic, right? And if you're controlled by blood, well, then you're passionate about things and you're sanguine, etc. Well, now if you say that the earth is composed of 4 elements, and you deduce from that human beings are composed by 4 humors, and you deduce from that those 4 humors, their balance or imbalance explains personalities, then you can also deduce from that diseases must be a result of imbalance of the elements. So in order to cure diseases, we need to bring about a harmony of the elements again. So it was felt that some people suffered from too much black bile. So they went off all the way up through the 19th century, by the way, even in the United States here, to all kinds of spas and took on the certain waters that were available, and those waters would induce purgation, right? So they would run between the spa and the outhouse, hoping to create a balance between their humors. If a person had too much blood, we know that they might go to a barber or a physician who might let open a vein and let some of that blood out, literally bloodletting. Well, if your whole idea is that there literally could be as many diseases as there were human beings, because we all had a different balance of humor, then that really kind of prevents you from developing any idea of pathology. That is the study of diseases and their causes. The major exception to the rule were periodic epidemics, which were thought to be related to cosmic forces like astrology. In fact, the English word influenza is derived from the belief that that type of disease was influenced by things that happened in the heavens. And for years, the movements of planets and even that of blood was seen as caused by the action of spirits or even of angels. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, as it occurred in Europe, turned that world of deduction upside down into a world of induction. That is, an inductive experimental world where the world was seen as a sum of its parts. Induction goes from the specific to the general, not like deduction, which goes from the general to the specific. So when we are scientific and inductive, we look at lots of observations, perform lots of experimentations, and then and only then do we come up with a general overarching hypothesis or theory. This was what Francis Bacon was stressing when he wrote his Novum Organum, which literally means the new method or the new logic, stressing the importance of induction, that nature began to be viewed like a machine. And like a machine, nature, its parts, and the relationship to one another were regarded as one day knowable by mankind. So what kinds of things became knowable by mankind? Well, let's start with astronomy first. And let's start with a man called Nicholas Copernicus, who wrote a book entitled On the Revolution of the Heavenly Orbs in 1543. Now, Copernicus was a Polish monk who argued for the heliocentric model of the universe. Helio meaning sun, centric, centered, or the sun-centered model of the universe. That is, that the Earth and planets revolved around the sun, not that the sun and the planets revolved around the Earth, as was generally thought. Now, this is not to claim that that no one had theorized about the heliocentric universe before then. In fact, the Greek Aristarchus had done so as early as 310 BC, but his views were not particularly popular. Well, later on, right around the same time actually, Galileo would come along, and he would take what had been a toy, a spyglass, perfect it into its telescope, point it towards the heavens, and he saw imperfections in the heavens. For example, the moon was pitted with craters and defaced by mountains. Then he also saw that 4 moons orbited Jupiter. Now this was significant because in the heliocentric model of the universe, everything would revolve around the sun. And here, and it would not be revolving around the Earth. Well, these Jupiter's moons were not revolving around the Earth. They were revolving around Jupiter, which was revolving around the sun. Hence, this was a further proof of the heliocentric model of the universe. Galileo is also associated with the principles of inertia and acceleration. He was tried by Papal Inquisition in 1633 and imprisoned and threatened with torture. Eventually, he recanted his Copernican views because the church at the time, and by the way, it was not only the Catholic Church, but many Protestants and Jews also did not accept Copernican views, because the whole idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, much of religion had been based upon the importance of man and the importance of man being the center of a universe created by God. Later on, Galileo went blind. He eventually died in 1642, and on his deathbed, he proclaimed, "Still it moves." That is, the earth moves, and the earth moves around the sun. Johannes Kepler, literally John Kepler, was a man who theorized that the planets move not in perfect circles, but in imperfect ellipses. Now, these imperfect ellipses were really going against what the Greeks always held. The Greeks always held that whatever was up there, the moon, the sun, the stars, they seemed to abide by perfect laws. And things here on Earth, they were just imperfect because they were always changing. But you could always count on the sun rising every morning and the sun setting every evening, and the constellations, and they'd be in the skies, etc., etc. And if anything were out of the ordinary, like if all of a sudden there was a meteor or something, well, then that must have been some sort of divine thing happening, something out of the ordinary. Well, Kepler saw that, the planets didn't move in perfect circles, and when Galileo pointed the telescope towards the moon and saw imperfections in the moon, he was essentially saying the same thing. What Kepler and Galileo did could essentially be broken down into two things. Number one, they claimed that both the heavens, the stuff out there, and the earth were subject to the same laws of nature. And secondly, they stated that these laws of nature were regulated by time. Kepler noted, for instance, that the planets moved more quickly in their orbits as they neared the sun. Well, this whole mathematics of time, or calculus, which Newton called fluxions, was developed separately by two people. Isaac Newton, he called calculus fluxions, and Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz, who created what we know today as calculus. Newton, by the way, was also known for his discovery of gravity, or the universal law of gravitation. Well, just as in astronomy many changes were occurring, so too in anatomy and medicine and biology and chemistry. For years and years, Galen, who lived from 130 to 200 AD, he was born of Greek parents and lived in the Roman Empire. His ideas on the human body and anatomy held sway for centuries. Now, the interesting thing about Roman days was that the Roman Empire prohibited dissection. So most Romans were cremated. And since there was a prohibition against dissection, the only way that you could kind of get in and see what the human body looked like was sort of by accident. For instance, Galen became a physician to gladiators. And of course, gladiators fought one another or animals to the death. So it was you can just imagine how they would suffer some very awful wounds. And as physician, he could go in and kind of take a peek inside the human body and see what it looked like. Galen did dissect monkeys and pigs. He deduced a great deal. Not all of it was accurate. So when it came to Galen, from years past, the theory was that the liver was the source of blood in the veins, and that the heart was the source of blood in the arteries. Well, we know that's not true. And William Harvey, and he wrote a work called Concerning the Motion of the Heart in 1628, said that the heart was like a pump, with blood circulating through the veins and the arteries. So the heart was a pump. Ulrich von Haller, meanwhile, found it that the nerves carried sensations and that the ingoing and outgoing nerves centered in the brain. Aristotle had considered the brain merely an air conditioning device, so to speak, designed to cool the overheated blood. In the 1660s, primitive microscopes were developed, and using a microscope, Robert Hooke in 1665 discovered that the bark of a tree was composed of cells. So now we have some changes in chemistry occurring. The Greeks had theorized about the existence of small indivisible particles or atoms. This was true of the Greek Meletus and his pupil Democritus. The theory, however, was not popular and was rejected by both Plato and Aristotle. And in 1661, in The Skeptical Chemist, Robert Boyle laid down the modern criterion of an element. Boyle is also known for his laws of gases. His experiments with gases and their compression and expansion seem to show that those gases must be composed of widely spaced. And so we continue our discussion here. Before we look at some other elements, and before we look at the democratic revolutions next week, we need to catch up a little bit, and this is a kind of a cool part of this PowerPoint and lecture, because here we're going to see in the discussion of England a variety of things sort of intersecting. So we're talking about, or we have talked about, absolutism, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today and how it sort of begins to end in England. This will be a transition eventually to democratization. We're also going to talk a little bit about how the Protestant Reformation really has an effect upon things, and a little bit about constitutionalism as we see countries like England moving towards a more constitutional system. Well, when we left off with England, we discussed Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Virgin Queen, so-called because she had never married. And we remember the Elizabethan era through a number of well-known writers, poets, dramatists, especially William Shakespeare. And he's known for his wonderful plays like Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, Macbeth, Richard III, Midsummer's Night Dream, and The Merchant of Venice, etc. Well, when Queen Elizabeth I died, the Tudor dynasty came to an official end. And remember, she was the Virgin Queen. She died without issue, that is, without children in 1603. So the next person in line for the succession had been, we remember, we talked about her, Mary Queen of Scots, but of course she had been executed by Queen Elizabeth I. But Mary Queen of Scots had a son, King James VI of Scotland. And so he became heir to the English throne in 1603. He ruled as James VI of Scotland and James I of England, and he was the first of the Stuart dynasty to rule England. And while he united the crowns of England and Scotland under the same monarch, the two nations were not officially united under the same parliament until 1707, when the Act of Union formally established what we call the United Kingdom. Well, let's talk a little bit about James I, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, because he was an example of an absolutist ruler. In fact, he believed in the divine right of kings. That is, that kings ruled because God willed them to rule. James, like many kings, desperately needed money. He attempted to raise the rates of customs duties without the approval of Parliament. As a result, Parliament resisted, so guess what? King James simply ruled without them. He did, however, convene 4 parliaments during his reign. He just didn't much listen to them. To raise money, he resorted to many other expedients, including forcing people to give him loans, fines, the sale of noble titles, things like that. Meanwhile, Parliament began to include more and more members of the Puritan Church who wanted to purify the Church of England. They thought the Church of England was still too hierarchical, still had too many rites and rituals, and they wanted to simplify it, to purify it, to bring it back to the early days of Christianity as they interpreted it, to make it literally more Protestant. The Puritans supported getting rid of bishops, abolishing bishops in the Church of England. And guess what? James I maintained, as one historian said, that no bishops meant no king, right? Where does it stop? You get rid of the hierarchy in the Protestant Church of England, and the next thing you're going to hit at is maybe the monarch himself. Catholics, like Puritans, were disappointed in James as king. Because remember, he was the son of a Catholic queen, so the Catholics were hoping that he would listen to their cause. However, disappointing both Puritans and Catholics, James I proved a steadfast supporter of the Church of England. He did agree to meet Puritan leaders at the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, but he rejected nearly all of their proposals except one, for a New English version of the Bible, and we've come to know that ever since as the King James Version. Catholics, dissatisfied by James's lack of support, attempted to blow up both king and parliament in 1605 in the Gunpowder Plot. Guy Fawkes, a Catholic, was caught with kegs of gunpowder in the basement of Parliament and was subsequently executed. Still to this day, on Guy Fawkes Day, in the United Kingdom, people play tricks on Catholics. James I attempted to end rebellion in Northern Ireland, which belonged to England, by seizing land in 6 northern counties and settling in Northern Ireland Scotch Presbyterians, Welsh, and English in the area known as Ulster. Now, Queen Elizabeth had introduced this Protestant colonization earlier on, and so James continued it. In colonial matters, we know James I's reign witnessed the settlement of Jamestown in 1607 in America. Also during his reign, dissatisfied separatists. Now, separatists differed from Puritans in that they wanted to literally separate themselves from the Church of England as opposed to purifying the Church of England from within. But separatists departed England aboard the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. When James I died in 1625, he was succeeded by his son Charles V, who did not have the diplomacy of his father and fought with Parliament over the customs duties called tonnage and poundage. Between 1629 and 1640, Charles attempted to rule without Parliament. And he did some things that we don't need to go into great detail, but he levied taxes called ship money on inland towns. And these taxes were literally to build ships for the Navy. The problem was that the coastal towns had always paid ship money because it made sense. But to have interior towns pay them, it was a highly unpopular move. Charles V also wanted to enforce high church standards in the Church of England, so he liked the rites and ritualism of the church. Dissatisfied, even more Puritans left England for America. And when Charles tried to restore the rules of bishops to the Church of Scotland and to impose other changes in the Church of Scotland, the Scots rose in rebellion. So we actually see now somebody trying to give more high church, to impose more high church changes to the Church of Scotland, which was the name for literally the Church of England and Scotland. And the Scots weren't going to put up with it. They rose in rebellion, and Charles, in order to put the rebellion down, could no longer ignore Parliament. He had to call Parliament in order to get the money, the tax revenues that he needed to finance the war in Scotland. In 1640, he called Parliament, but it refused to grant him money until he met their grievances. Called the Short Parliament in British history, he dissolved it within 3 weeks. Next, he reconvened a totally new Parliament, which is known in history as the Long Parliament. Under the leadership of John Pym and the Puritans, the Long Parliament succeeded in having a number of its grievances met, and it passed the Triennial Act, whereby the king could no longer attempt to rule without Parliament. he was required, the monarch was required to convene Parliament at least once in 3 years. Increasingly, the Long Parliament became more radical, even introducing an act to abolish bishops in the Church of England. Eventually, Parliament divided into two factions: the Cavaliers, who supported the kings, versus the Roundheads, who supported the Puritans. And they were really given these derogatory terms by their opposition. So, for instance, the Roundheads, who supported the Puritans, that was a derogatory term coined by their opposition to refer to their very short, clipped hair. Well, civil war erupted in England in 1642, and the king lost. In January 1649, a rump parliament composed of the supporters of the victorious General Oliver Cromwell, hence the term rump, after Cromwell's critics and the army detractors had been purged. The only thing left of Parliament was a rump of Cromwell supporters. They tried Charles I for treason, found him guilty, and executed him. The European continent was shocked by this and referred to the English as king killers. This was regicide. A republican government, or commonwealth, meaning the common welfare, the common weal, the commonwealth of everyone, was proclaimed, headed by Oliver Cromwell. Both the monarchy and the House of Lords of the Parliament were abolished. Meanwhile, those who supported the monarch and Catholics were supporting Charles II, the son of Charles I, to become again king. And they waged the rebellion in Ireland. So you see, sometimes these other areas of the empire, for instance, Ireland, can be used for rebellion. So you can see how things get tricky. How do you begin to separate who the good supportive Irish are of the Commonwealth and who are those who are rebelling against Cromwell? In retaliation, about 2/3 of the Irish land south of Ulster was confiscated and given to English Protestants. So this is really where England began to punish the Catholics of Ireland, and a long-standing feud would arise. Next, Cromwell led the army to victory against Charles II in Scotland. Finally, he warred against the Dutch. And the Commonwealth government officially lasted until 1653. Then in 1658, it was replaced in 1653, by years of controlled experimentation by Cromwell and his supporters. And in 1658, Oliver Cromwell died, and his son Richard Cromwell, called Tumbledown Dick because he really didn't want the position and ruled for a short while before abdicating, took over. In this vacuum of power, in 1660, Parliament invited the Stuart dynasty in what was termed the Restoration to return to the throne. King Charles II, the son of Charles I, subsequently ruled from 1660 until 1685. His reign included a number of important developments. And since he was invited by the Parliament to rule, the Parliament made certain that he developed a cabinet. And a cabinet was a small group of inner ministers to the king. So they're seeing that they're having more and more, the Parliament and the cabinet now will have more and more control over the king. Parliament was learning, too, that they could control the king's selection of ministers to that cabinet by refusing to carry on business until a change of ministers was made. This was the beginning of a process that we're going to talk about next week called responsible government, where ministers became responsible to Parliament rather than to the king himself. Charles II was a great admirer of King Louis XIV of France, and that is interesting because we know King Louis XIV of France was kind of the absolute monarch of Europe. It was also during Charles II's time that this commercial rivalry between England and Holland emerged, and the English literally seized New Amsterdam in America and renamed it New York. So, New York City became English during that time. And finally, a two-party system began to develop and emerge in England over the issue of whether Charles II's brother, James, who publicly declared his conversion to Catholicism in 1672, could succeed him. Those, of course, who supported the court, the king, were called the Tories. Those who supported the opposition were called the Country Party, and the Whigs were the ones who wanted to exclude James from the throne. Meanwhile, in 1665, a plague hit hit London, taking 70,000 lives. A year later, in the Great Fire of 1666, London was virtually destroyed. It was largely rebuilt through the planning of the great architect Sir Christopher Wren, who designed the new St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which still stands. 1666, the Great Fire, the biblical idea of the Antichrist, 666. A lot of people thought this Great Fire was a punishment from God. And so a lot of intersections are occurring here between religion and politics and just an understanding of the basic things that are happening in the world. In 1685, Charles II died. On his deathbed, by the way, he converted to Catholicism. And James II became King of England and ruled from 1685 to 1688. He appointed Catholics to university and army posts, and he issued a declaration of indulgence stopping the operation of all laws against Roman Catholics and also against Protestant dissenters like the Puritans. James II's first wife had been Protestant, and their daughter by that marriage was Mary, the wife of William, Prince of Orange in Holland, who was raised Protestant. So too was their other daughter, Anne. Therefore, Protestants hoped that upon James II's death, Mary, his Protestant daughter, would rule England. But a surprise occurred. James' first wife had died in 1671. He had declared his conversion to Catholicism in 1672. 1673, he married a Catholic, Maria of Modena. And no one thought that they would ever, they were getting older, have a son. Well, the couple did have a son in the summer of 1688, and Protestants became very upset, as did James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, because everybody knew that when the son grew up, of course, he would become king. Sons came in those days before women taking over the throne of England. Well, lots of people became upset, and Mary and her husband landed with an army across the English Channel. They were over. William of Orange, he was over in Holland. James II fled the country, and in a bloodless, and hence it's been called Glorious Revolution of 1688, Parliament offered the throne to William and Mary, provided they accept the terms of a great constitutional document called the Declaration. Later, it was called the Bill of Rights. And that stated that the monarch ruled at the pleasure of Parliament, not divine right. John Locke became the patron saint, as one historian said, of the Revolution when he justified its legitimacy for the contract theory of government in his 1692 treatises of government. This is very important because the Glorious Revolution means that Parliament invited William and Mary to be monarchs. But they had to agree that they did not rule by divine right. They ruled because Parliament asked them to rule. Don't forget John Locke. We're going to come back to him in a minute. So now it's time for us to look at the last part of this lecture, which is the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. It originated in the late 1600s, gained increasing impetus after 1715 with the death of Louis XIV, lasted into the late 18th century and possibly the early 19th century when it gave way to Romanticism. Precursors of the Enlightenment included writers like Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan in 1651. And it was in the Leviathan that Hobbes said that in the state of nature, the original state of nature, the life of man was, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, end quote. Man instituted government as a necessary evil, comparable to the Old Testament monster, the Leviathan. Sovereignty came from the people, who transferred it to the monarch by implicit contract. The power of the ruler, while absolute, Hobbes said, however, the kings do not hold their power by divine right. So you see, people are starting to, nick away at this idea of divine right, absolutism anyhow. The religious wars of these years had convinced many of the need for rationalism or reason in society, that things needed to depend upon reason, that nothing was to be accepted on faith. Everything had to be submitted to the rational. They thought that through the scientific method, people could discover the laws of human society. Those who kind of were secular philosophers leading this movement were called philosophes, and they called for reforms, a number of reforms including liberty, brotherhood, deism, the separation of powers, laissez-faire economics, etc. So, some of the Enlightenment figures included John Locke, who wrote an essay concerning human understanding in 1690. Locke thought that all of us were born with literally a blank tablet, a tabula rasa, that all of our experiences would help form our minds. In his second treatise of civil government, he defended the Glorious Revolution and said that government was a contract to protect life, liberty, and property, that citizens had a natural right of rebellion against tyrannical government. For Locke, the state of nature, he said, was completely free and equal. He's known for the saying, in the beginning, all the world was America, end quote. That is, he and others thought that noble savages like those found in America were what originally the world was like before there was government, and that government was invented as a preservation of freedom. So where Hobbes looked at things as kind of gloomy, people were fighting with one another, and so they had to, protect themselves, so they created a government to do that. Locke was a more sunny, optimistic person and said, well, things were pretty nice in the original state of nature, and people developed or established governments in order to protect their freedoms. There were other Enlightenment figures like Baron de Montesquieu, who wrote The Spirit of the Laws. He talked a lot about the need for checks and balances in government to retain liberty. Voltaire certainly is a well-known figure, as well as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his Social Contract of 1762. He is known for his saying, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." It was a defense of the growing movement towards democracy. And then Adam Smith, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nation, argued for laissez-faire economics, literally meaning to leave alone. That the invisible hand of economics, of Adam Smith's theory, was a belief that the people, if you let the people alone and they sought their own self-interest economically, that the entire economy would benefit, that the intervention by the government was not necessary. So Adam Smith and all of these Enlightenment figures are talking about the importance of individualism. Now, whether we like individualism or not, or think that, in our Western society, individualism has gone too far and we've become selfish, is not necessarily material here. What we're studying is how did this concentration, this focus on individualism come about in the first place? And it's through the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment and democratization, which we'll look at next week, that this individualism becomes an important component of Western civilization and ultimately of modern civilization. Ideas of the Enlightenment included the right to happiness. This is something that the U.S. Declaration of Independence talks about. That science should serve the benefit of humanity. That reason can make human lives better, ridding us of superstitions and prejudices that lead to suffering, inhumanity, and injustice. John Locke in The Education of Children. The best way to educate children, he said, was to encourage them, to teach them by good example, not to beat them. That prisons should become places of rehabilitation. That there should be a distinction between the public and private spheres, a separation of church and state, freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and that torture should be abolished. That those in power should be held accountable. That natural laws applied to society. And there was a vast effort to synthesize all of human nature in the first encyclopedia. Natural laws, they thought, should also be applied to economics. And so there was, again, Adam Smith, his laissez-faire. Also the physiocrats who wanted to eliminate tariffs and guild restrictions, etc. They wanted to eliminate everything they associated with government, too much government intervention, which back in those days was the economic belief in mercantilism. There was also an Enlightenment belief in progress, and that progress was seen in things like the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And finally, there was an idea of a balance of power, a harmony in politics that literally could also take place. Well, all of this is very interesting from a number of perspectives, and one of them is the search for a balance of power. It arises out of the Enlightenment, the sense that there should be and can be a balance of power in the world among the major nations. And we see it happening especially in a war called the War of the Spanish Succession from 1702 to 1714. Charles II, the King of Spain, who ruled there during a nice long period, died in 1700 and had no direct heir, so here he is, he died. The nearest heirs to the throne would be through the Bourbon dynasty of France. Remember Louis XIV? His son Louis. This is Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou of the Bourbon dynasty. Over here is the Habsburg side. And we see the Habsburg grandson, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. Well, I needn't tell you what's going to happen here. There's going to be a war. Louis XIV is going to claim the throne for his grandson, Philip of Anjou. The rest of the European powers were intensely worried that if France, the ruling houses of France and Spain were united, This would upset the balance of power. France was already, in their opinion, too powerful. So a grand alliance formed against France. England, Holland, Austria, that is the Habsburgs, Brandenburg, Prussia, all joined in a grand alliance against France. France was so powerful with its army at that time that basically the Allies became tired by the fighting and agreed to a Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. By that treaty, Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, was recognized as King of Spain. He was of the French Bourbon dynasty, and from that point on, the same family, the Bourbon dynasty, would rule France and Spain, but by the treaty, it would not be the same person. As sort of a consolation prize, the Austrian Habsburgs received the Spanish Netherlands, Milan in Italy, Naples, and Sardinia. Philip V retained Spain and the Spanish Overseas Empire, but again as kind of a consolation prize to the English. England received the Asiento, an agreement for 30 years, whereby a British company received the right to import slaves into the Spanish colonies, and also to sell there duty-free a certain amount of merchandise. Also as a consolation, England received Gibraltar, Minorca, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the shores of Hudson Bay, so it was increasing its territory in North America. And the Margrave of Brandenburg, we talked about Brandenburg, became recognized as the King of Prussia. Interesting, look how these European powers are dividing up the map so that they can get to a balance of power, because in this new age of the scientific revolution and, of course, of the Enlightenment, there had to be natural laws which applied to governments, and there must be a balance of power. This is what then Europe looked like in 1715. As you see here, the French Bourbon lands. You see in green the Austrian Habsburg lands, so they took over the Austrian Netherlands, which will later on become known as Belgium. Great Britain is down here in Gibraltar and down here in Minorca, and if we would go over the Atlantic Ocean, we would see that they gained important lands in North America. The Prussian lands are here, Brandenburg, Prussia, so here we see Prussia, which would eventually become Germany, beginning to become powerful, and then of course you see the Spanish Bourbon lands. So from now on, these two are going to be the same family, but different rulers of the same family. The War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748 also showed a concern over the balance of power. Emperor Charles VI, the Habsburg dynasty of Austria, died in 1740, and his daughter, Maria Theresa, was to succeed him. He had gone, around to all the important rulers of Europe and said, I know that in the Austrian Habsburg rule, we've never had a woman ruler before, and they all agreed to it, etc., etc. But Frederick II, or Frederick the Great of nearby Prussia, saw an opportunity. And in 1740, he came to the throne, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and he invaded the Austrian province of Silesia. Silesia was a very prosperous area of the Habsburg lands with 1.2 million people and factories and mines. In the end, this whole piece was settled at Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, and Prussia got to keep Silesia, which it had invaded. This was the greatest permanent conquest of territory up to this time made by any power in the history of modern Western Europe. So Prussia, is really starting to become important. Finally, the 7 Years' War. Britain and France had been from 1754 at war with one another over their colonies in North America. We called this war in America the French and Indian War. It became known as the larger World War of the 7 Years' War. And again, in an attempt to achieve a balance of power, the Treaty of Paris of 1763, Britain gained Canada, Florida, and all of the land east of the Mississippi River except New Orleans. France was left with no territory in North America as it gave Louisiana to Spain in compensation for dragging Spain into the war. Britain received India except for 2 places. 1763 marks the great rise of Great Britain as a world power. It's 1763, and we see here, actually we don't see there, I meant to put a map there, but forgot. But anyhow, we're going to talk a little bit about what ramifications that had for the United States, what later on becomes the United States, and how the colonies and the 13 colonies were very dissatisfied with Britain after 1763. Until next week, have fun. If you have any questions, let me know.